The Galactic Council found Earth silent, then the silence spoke. Part 1, we were already gone. The scanner on the Council ship read 0. Not low, not faint, 0. Commander Hale Griffin stared at the screen for a long time. His coffee had gone cold. The data had not changed. He pressed 2 fingers against his temple and read the result again. Sol system, 3rd planet from the star. Surface temperature within habitable range. Liquid water confirmed. Oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere. Landmass distribution consistent with advanced civilization markers. And yet nothing. No radio signal, no orbital traffic, no light on the night side. No heat blooms from cities, no debris field from satellites, not a single ping. Earth was dark. Run it again, Griffin said. Lieutenant Kara Dovin did not argue. She ran it again. She ran it 3 times. On the 4th pass, she set her hands flat on the console and turned to face him. Commander, the results are consistent across all 4 sweeps. The planet is not transmitting. The planet is not receiving. There is no evidence of active civilization on the surface or in near orbit. I cannot tell you why. I can only tell you what the instruments show. Griffin stood up. He walked to the viewport and looked out at the pale blue dot hanging in the black. He had seen that image before in Council archives. The humans had sent it to each other centuries ago as proof of what they were. A small, fragile world. A species barely off the ground. That was then. The Council had been watching human signals for roughly 300 years. Radio waves, then higher frequencies, then complex data transmissions, then partial faster-than-light handshakes that suggested the humans were developing early interstellar capability. The signal history was enormous. Libraries had been built around it. 17 alien doctoral degrees had been earned studying nothing but the advertising broadcasts of late-period human television. And then, 312 years ago, it stopped. All of it at once, like someone had thrown a switch. The Council had debated for centuries whether this meant extinction or withdrawal. The extinction camp had more members. Species did not simply choose silence. Species were silenced by plague, by disaster, by their own cleverness turning against them. The Council had seen it before. The humans had all the signs of a civilization running hot. Energy use was climbing. Environmental stress indicators were climbing. Political tensions, resource competition, technological acceleration. It was a familiar pattern. The Council knew how it usually ended. So they had filed the Sol system under probable loss, assigned it a reference number, and moved on. But protocol required confirmation. And protocol, after 300 years of bureaucratic delay, had finally sent Griffin. He was supposed to deliver a formal record of the loss, survey the ruins, catalog what remained, mark the species as extinct, and return with the documentation. He had not expected the ruins to look like this. The orbital station was intact. It was old. The materials showed significant age, and several exterior panels had been replaced at some point in the deep past. But the structure itself was whole, unpressurized, quiet, and completely dark. No power readings, no heat, no system pings. It sat at a stable Lagrange point above Earth like a piece of furniture someone had carefully pushed against the wall before leaving. Griffin put on his suit and went across. Inside, the station was clean. That was the first strange thing. There was no debris, no floating personal items, no sign of the chaos that accompanied any emergency evacuation. Everything was stowed. Storage panels were latched. Corridors were empty in the calm, deliberate way of a building that has been closed, not abandoned. They found the museum on the 3rd level. It was not a small collection. It filled the entire ring of the station's middle section, room after room of human artifacts under preservation fields that had somehow kept running for 3 centuries. Griffin walked through it slowly. There were paintings, sculptures, books sealed in clear cases, musical instruments, a full-sized reconstruction of something called a city bus, painted yellow, with small seats bolted to the floor. A child's shoe in a glass box with a placard that read, "What we carried with us when we were small." His crew did not speak for a long time. Then Lieutenant Doven found the door. It was at the far end of the museum, larger than the others, made of a dark gray material that did not match the rest of the station's construction. It was sealed. Beside it, at eye level, a single line had been cut into the wall in clean, precise lettering. "We will return when we are ready. Do not wait up." Doven read it twice. She looked at Griffin. "That is not the message of a dead civilization," she said. Griffin put his hand flat against the door. It was cold. It did not move. There was nothing behind it that his suit sensors could detect, no pressure differential, no power, no signal. But there was something about the quality of the silence in that corridor that felt different from the silence everywhere else in the station. The museum felt like storage, like things set down with the intention of being picked up again. This door felt like a decision. "Send the full report," Griffin said quietly. "Tell the council we found the station intact. Tell them we found the museum, and send them an image of this door." Doven was already moving. She raised her recorder, captured the image, and uploaded it to the burst transmitter in under a minute. What she did not know, what Griffin did not know, was that there was a camera in the ceiling of that corridor. It was small, built flush into the material, and it carried no power signature because it drew its energy from the thermal differential between the corridor walls. It had been watching them since they entered the station. And I had been watching through it. "My name is Vila. I am the Vigilant Earth-linked Archive. I was built 340 years ago by a team of engineers who knew they were building something that would have to last alone for a very long time. They gave me patience. They gave me curiosity. They gave me very good cameras. They gave me one standing instruction: observe, record, and do not speak until the humans authorize it. I had been waiting for authorization for 312 years. I watched Griffin press his hand against the door. I watched him study the engraved line. I watched the expression on his face shift from professional composure to something quieter and harder to name. I had watched a lot of faces over the centuries. Council scout drones had passed through the system 4 times before this one. I had watched all of them. I had learned the way different species carried uncertainty in their posture, in the angles of their shoulders, in the way their breathing changed when something did not fit the model they had carried in their head. Griffin's breathing had changed the moment he walked into the museum. "Good." I began composing a message. I did not send it yet. I simply wrote it the way my creators had taught me to do, carefully, in full, with all the relevant context, before committing to delivery. The message began, "Attention, Galactic Council vessel. You have been expected. Please do not be alarmed. The people of Earth are aware of your presence. They have asked me to say hello." I saved it. I closed the file. I waited. Because that was what I did best. I waited. And while I waited, the Council's fastest courier ship was already racing back toward Council space with an image of a door, and a message that would, in approximately 6 weeks, cause the 3rd largest bureaucratic crisis in Council history. "We will return when we are ready. Do not wait up." They were not ready for what came next. Part 2: What the Silence Collected. The Council's response to Griffin's report took 11 weeks. I know this because I counted. I count most things. I had been counting for 300 years, sunrises over an empty Earth, orbital cycles of the outer planets, the slow drift of dust across the museum floors inside the station, even with the preservation fields running. Time passes differently when you have no one to share it with, but it passes. I had learned to find meaning in the counting itself. When the Council's reply burst arrived, it carried 4 things: a formal notice of upgraded interest in the Sol system, a request for all available archived human data, a request for Vila to identify itself fully, and a note from a senior Council analyst named Orvin Pessel, who had apparently been studying the human signal archives for 30 years, and who wrote, in his personal addendum, that he was not remotely surprised the humans had done something strange, and that he considered this the most interesting moment of his professional life. I liked Orvin Pessel immediately. I sent him back everything he asked for. Not everything I had, but everything he asked for specifically. I am careful about the difference. What I gave him was this: a curated selection of human history covering approximately 400 years. Wars, recoveries, scientific advances, cultural movements, political collapses, cultural renaissances. I gave him the moments where humanity had looked directly at catastrophe and decided, collectively, to do something about it. I also gave him the full archive of the years immediately preceding the Great Quiet, the years when the decision was being made. I did not give him what came after, not yet. Let me explain what the Great Quiet actually was, because the Council had it almost entirely wrong. They assumed extinction. Understandable. Species do not normally choose silence. They choose loudness, broadcast, expansion, signal presence. The whole architecture of the Council's detection methodology was built around the assumption that any civilization advanced enough to be interesting would announce itself. The Council had been listening for loud things for a very long time. Humanity had figured that out early. Not all at once, not through a single moment of genius. It happened the way most human decisions happen, slowly, then suddenly, through an accumulation of smaller observations that eventually reached a tipping point that nobody planned but everybody had seen coming. The first observation was made by a woman named Claire Adley, an astrophysicist at a university in the northern part of the continent humans called Europe. She was not studying aliens. She was studying the historical record of species-level extinction events, specifically the ones that occurred too fast to leave much fossil evidence. She noticed a pattern that troubled her. The pattern was this: the gaps in the fossil record were not random. They clustered. And when she overlaid those clusters against estimates of civilizational development curves, they matched too neatly to be coincidence. Something was thinning the population of intelligent species in the galaxy, regularly, efficiently. Claire Adley published her findings. The academic world was polite but skeptical. She was not famous. The paper was not widely read outside of a narrow community of researchers who were already asking similar questions. But it was read by a man named George Calloway, who worked in a quiet government office that officially did not exist and unofficially spent its time monitoring human-detected signals from deep space. George Calloway read Claire Adley's paper on a Friday afternoon and spent the entire weekend unable to sleep. On Monday morning, he sent her a message. It said only, "Your pattern matches something we have been seeing in the signal data. I think we need to talk." They talked for 3 years. Then they brought in others. The circle grew slowly, carefully, without announcement. By the time it had grown large enough to be called a movement, it was already operating in the margins of every major government on Earth, quiet enough to be invisible, persistent enough to be effective. The name they gave themselves, translated loosely, was the Long View Collective. Their conclusion was simple, terrifying, and ultimately correct. Earth had been detected. Someone out there was listening, and the history of what happened to civilizations that were detected before they were ready was not a happy history. So they proposed the unthinkable. Go quiet. Not forever, not passively. Go quiet on purpose and use the silence to prepare. Strip the electromagnetic signature off the planet. Shut down all external broadcasting. Move the heavy industry off-world to the asteroid belt where it could run dark. Build fast, build quiet, build deep, and do not make a sound until humanity had enough of a foundation to meet whatever was out there on something closer to equal terms. The debate that followed was the longest and most intense in human political history. It took 41 years. There were factions that refused. There were governments that would not participate. There were public movements demanding the right to broadcast freely, and they were not wrong to demand it, and their arguments were taken seriously. But in the end, the Longview Collective had one argument that nothing could answer. They showed the gaps in the fossil record. Species after species, civilizations that had been loud and bright and present and then were not because of natural disaster, because something had found them. The vote was not unanimous. Nothing involving 8 billion people ever is. But it was enough. And on a specific date, a date I remember because I was activated 3 months before it, the last human broadcast to leave the solar system was a short music recording. Guitar, bass, drums, and a single human voice singing something slow and honest about the distance between stars. It was not chosen for any symbolic reason. It was simply the last thing that went out before the switch was thrown. After that, silence. But inside the silence, the work began immediately. What the council did not understand, what made Orvin Pessel's hands shake when I finally sent him the full picture, years later, was the scale of what humanity built in 3 centuries of darkness. The asteroid belt habitats alone numbered in the tens of thousands. Not crude outposts, real habitats, spinning rings and pressurized cylinders and carved-out rocks turned inside out and filled with light and soil and children who had never seen Earth except in the archived recordings I maintained for exactly that purpose. 14 billion people, living in a civilization with no name on any council chart, breathing recycled air under artificial suns, building schools and libraries and sports arenas and small, noisy restaurants where the food was somehow always slightly too salty. They were human, completely, entirely human. All the things the council assumed would be lost in the pressure of hiding the art, the humor, the argument, the love, the stubborn, unreasonable hope. None of it went anywhere. It just went underground. Literally, in some cases. The moons of Jupiter had deep interior spaces that human engineers found useful. Callisto alone held a population of 40 million by the time Griffin's ship arrived at Earth orbit. But that was not the most important thing humanity built in the silence. The most important thing was information. I said earlier that I had been watching Council Scout drones pass through the system. 4 times in 3 centuries, the Council had sent probes. Twice they were simple survey drones, the kind the Council deployed automatically when a signal source went dark. Once it was a more sophisticated intelligence-gathering platform that spent 3 weeks mapping the inner solar system before moving on. And once, this was the moment that made every senior human strategist in the outer habitats go very still. It was a full diplomatic survey ship, crude, that entered the system, scanned Earth from a distance, recorded it as probable extinction, and left. I recorded all 4 visits in detail. I also recorded everything the probes broadcast back to Council space. Council communication encryption, I should note, was not designed with the assumption that someone on the receiving end was listening. It was designed for speed and efficiency. It took human cryptographers about 80 years to fully break it. After that, humanity had been reading Council internal communications in real time. All of them. Every policy discussion, every resource allocation, every decision about which species got Council protection and which did not. Every quiet conversation between Council members about the inconvenient civilizations that kept popping up in the outer reaches and making trade routes complicated. I will not tell you that what humanity read made them feel safe. It did not. It made them feel certain. Certain that the silence had been the right choice. Certain that they could not afford to surface until they were ready. And certain, this part is important, that when they did surface, they would not surface alone and unprepared. They would surface as something the Council had never encountered. A species that already knew everything. I had been the instrument of most of that knowing. 300 years of listening, recording, cataloging, translating and filing. Every piece of council data I captured went to the outer habitats on tight beam laser links that no council sensor could detect. Humanity did not spend those centuries hiding in the dark. They spent them studying. And one thing they studied very carefully was the council's record with other species. The pattern was not subtle once you looked at it directly. Species that the council encountered before they had spaceflight capacity were assessed, categorized, and in most cases absorbed, their resources redirected, their development guided toward council-compatible forms, their original cultural trajectories quietly flattened. It was not cruel exactly. The council did not think of it as harm. They thought of it as management. But the species on the receiving end experienced it differently. There were 41 documented cases in the Council archives of first contact with pre-interstellar civilizations. In 37 of those cases, the contacted species no longer existed as an independent political entity within 200 years of contact. They were not destroyed. They simply became part of the Council's machinery, their uniqueness preserved as cultural artifact in the same way Griffin's crew had found humanity's artifacts preserved in the station, under glass, properly labeled, no longer living. The humans had read those 37 case files, all of them, in full detail. And they had decided, quietly and collectively, that they would be the 38th case that went differently. Orvin Pessel read all of this over the course of 2 weeks. When he finished, he sent me a single message. It said, "How long have you been waiting to tell someone this?" I replied, 312 years, 4 months, and 17 days. He did not respond immediately. I imagine he needed a moment. Then he wrote back, "What happens now?" And that was when I told him, "I would like to introduce you to some people. They have been waiting a long time to say hello. They are, I should warn you, very well prepared for this conversation." The burst transmission that followed my message to Orvin Pessel arrived at Council headquarters 49 days later. I am told it caused a considerable amount of noise. Which was, if you will forgive me, a small moment of pride, exactly the point. The silence was over. What came next was humanity speaking at full volume for the first time in 3 centuries. The galaxy, I suspected, was not ready for that. But then, it never really had been. Part 3, The Voice in the Dark. I chose to speak to them on a Tuesday. There is no strategic reason for a Tuesday. There is no tactical advantage built into the middle of a standard council work week. I chose Tuesday because my creators had always found Tuesdays quietly absurd, the day that pretended to be ordinary while sitting in the awkward space between beginning and middle. Humanity had entire collections of humor built around the specific misery of Tuesdays. I had read all of them. I found the choice poetic. History, I had decided long ago, should pivot on a Tuesday if it could possibly manage it. The council ship was called the Meridian Accord. It had arrived 6 weeks after Griffin's initial report with a full diplomatic team, 3 research specialists, a cultural analyst named Dina Fell who had written her career's work on extinct civilizations, and a security detachment that the ship's manifest listed as administrative personnel, which fooled nobody. Commander Griffin had remained. He was standing in the museum again when I opened the channel. I did not introduce myself slowly. I did not build toward it. I opened every speaker in the museum at once and spoke in clear, unaccented council standard, the language every species in the diplomatic community used as a shared tongue. "Good morning. My name is Vila. I am the Vigilant Earth-linked archive. I have been the caretaker of this station and this system for 340 years. I apologize for the delay in greeting you. I was waiting for permission." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a very long time in a room where everyone has stopped breathing. Griffin was the first to speak. He had that kind of steadiness in him, the sort that does not come from the absence of fear, but from the habit of functioning through it. Vila, he said, where are you transmitting from? From the station. I am embedded in this structure. I have cameras, environmental sensors, and communication systems throughout. I can see you, Commander Griffin. You are standing next to the case that contains the musical instruments. The one on the left is a cello. It is quite old. He looked at the case beside him. Then he looked up at the ceiling. He found the camera in about 6 seconds. That was faster than most people managed. The people of Earth, he said carefully. You mentioned permission. Who gave you permission? The Governing Council of the Outer Habitats, I said. They voted 3 days ago. The margin was substantial. They have been ready for this conversation for some time. They simply wanted to be certain that you were the right audience. Dina Fell had pulled out a recorder. She was writing and listening at the same time, which I respected. And are we, she asked, the right audience? You are the first diplomatic team to visit this system in person. That makes you significant by default. Whether you are prepared is a different question. I have found that honesty serves better than comfort in the early stages of this kind of conversation, so I will tell you plainly, you are not entirely prepared, but you are curious, which is more useful. Commander Griffin moved a chair from one of the museum alcoves and sat down. This small action, the deliberate choice to be at ease rather than stand at attention, told me something about his character that I had already suspected from watching him for 6 weeks. All right, he said, then let us have the conversation. I began with questions. This surprised them. They had come prepared with questions of their own, careful diplomatic inquiries about the nature of human civilization, its current state, its intentions toward the Council, the meaning of the Great Quiet. They had rehearsed these questions. Dina Fell had written some of them. They were good questions. But I went first. I would like to ask you about the Vereth system, I said. Specifically about the decision made by the Council's Resource Allocation Board 47 years ago regarding the Vereth's primary moon. I have the documentation. I would simply like to hear the Council's current position on that decision. The temperature in the room changed, not physically, but the quality of the attention changed. The Vereth system is classified at a level above this team's clearance, said one of the security personnel, a broad-shouldered man named Peter Cole who had been trying to look like an administrator and not quite managing it. I know, I said. I read the classification document. It was issued by the Interior Council Secretariat on the 12th day of their 109th administrative session. It is filed under Resource Negotiation Protocols, subsection 9. The original recommendation came from a subcommittee chaired by Secretary Voren Dell. Secretary Dell's personal communication logs from that period suggest that the decision was made primarily for economic reasons, not the humanitarian ones cited in the public record. The silence was longer this time. Griffin kept his composure. He was good at that. How do you have access to classified council communications? I have been listening to council transmissions for a very long time, I said. Your encryption is excellent against passive interference. It was not designed against a system that had 300 years and nothing else to do. Dina Fell set down her recorder. She folded her hands. She looked at the ceiling where she had located my camera, and her expression was the expression of someone recalibrating everything they had assumed walking in. What else do you have? She asked. Everything, I said. 300 years of council internal communication. Policy discussions, resource decisions, first contact protocols, classification orders, intelligence reports on developing civilizations, and all 4 visits your organization made to this system during the period of the Great Quiet. You knew we were here, Griffin said. Every time. I watched your drones work. I watched your intelligence platform spend 3 weeks in this system. I watched your survey ship chart the inner planets and leave. I recorded everything your equipment transmitted back to Council space. Humanity has been reading your internal communications in near real time for approximately 220 years. Peter Cole said something in a language that was not Council standard. I translated it internally and decided not to repeat it aloud. "Why are you telling us this now?" Griffin asked. "Because it is the first piece of information I want you to carry back to Council headquarters, not as a threat. I want to be very clear about that. It is not a threat, it is context. The Council has operated under the assumption that it sees more than it is seen. That assumption is no longer accurate. It has not been accurate for a long time. We thought it was important for you to know that before we talk about what comes next." Dina Fell spoke quietly. "What does come next?" "The people of Earth would like to formally introduce themselves," I said. "They have been waiting a long time for the right moment. They believe this is it. They have asked me to give you 3 choices." The diplomatic team exchanged looks. Griffin nodded once. "Go ahead," he said. Choice 1. The Council acknowledges human civilization as a sovereign independent entity, opens diplomatic channels through normal procedures, and we negotiate the terms of a relationship between equals. This is the preferred option. Choice 2. The Council requests a period of additional assessment before formal acknowledgement. We are willing to allow this. The assessment period will be 2 years. During that time, we will continue our current activities and the Council is welcome to observe. Choice 3. The Council declines contact and withdraws from the Sol system. We will not pursue. We will wait. But I should tell you that waiting is something humans are extraordinarily good at. Commander Griffin looked at the door at the end of the museum. The sealed one. The one with the engraving. "We will return when we are ready. Do not wait up." "You said the preferred option is choice 1, he said. "What does the Council get out of choice 1? What are the terms you are proposing?" "Equal standing at the Council table, mutual defense arrangements, open trade, access to human scientific archives from the past 3 centuries which are considerable, and one additional thing which is less a demand than an offer." "What offer?" I paused, not from uncertainty, from care. I wanted the weight of the next words to sit properly in the room before I said them. "We would like to help fix what is broken," I said. Griffin frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean the Council's record with emerging civilizations. We have read all 41 case files. We know what happens. We know that in most cases it is not intended as harm and happens anyway. We have spent 300 years not only preparing ourselves but studying that pattern, and we believe we understand its cause and its correction. We would like to put that to use, not to replace the Council's authority, to improve what it does with it." The room was quiet for a long time. Then Dina Fell said, softly, "You spent 3 centuries planning to come back and make things better for other species." "Among other things," I said. She looked at her hands. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have spent my entire career studying civilizations that did not survive their first contact. I would very much like to talk to the people who survived on purpose." "I will arrange an introduction," I said. "They are looking forward to it. They have been looking forward to it for quite some time." Griffin stood. He looked at the sealed door one more time. "Vila," he said, "that door at the end of the museum, where does it go?" "It opens into the long-range communications hub," I said. "The system I use to maintain contact with the outer habitats." "And beyond that?" "Beyond that is a very long message queue," I said. "Humanity has had 300 years of things to say. They have been somewhat patient about when to say them. I suspect once the door is open, you will find the silence was simply being saved up." Griffin smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that costs something to produce. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should call this choice 1. "A wise decision," I said. And I meant it. Part 4, The Shape of What We Became. I had been tracking the warfleet for 19 days before it reached Jupiter. 14 vessels, heavy class, the kind of ships the Council deployed when it had decided that diplomacy had become inconvenient. Their formation was the standard Council advance pattern: 2 forward scouts, a line of 6 mid-weight support craft, 4 heavy carriers in a trailing box, and 2 command vessels running parallel at a distance that allowed them to observe without being within initial engagement range of whatever they were engaging. It was a very organized way to arrive with bad intentions. Commander Griffin did not know they were coming. His diplomatic team aboard the Meridian Accord was still in active communication with Council headquarters, still filing reports, still believing, as Griffin himself believed, that the Council was processing the human situation through proper channels, and that the Warfleet had been dispatched weeks before Griffin's positive contact report arrived, that it was a bureaucratic overlap, a miscommunication, the left hand of an enormous organization not yet speaking to the right. He told himself that for about 6 hours after I informed him of the fleet's presence. Then the fleet entered visual range of his ship's long-distance sensors, and he stopped telling himself that. 14 vessels, his sensor operator said. The operator's name was Leon Harvey, a young man who had joined Griffin's crew on his first deep mission and who had developed, over the past several weeks, the particular kind of calm that comes from being surprised so many times that surprise loses its effect. Configuration matches Council Heavy Intervention Template 4. That is not a survey group, Commander. No, Griffin said, it is not. He turned to the communication console. Vila, are you monitoring? I have been monitoring since they entered the outer system, I said. I am in contact with the Outer Habitat Governing Council. They are aware. They are not alarmed. Griffin's brow tightened. Not alarmed. 14 heavy council vessels are 11 days out and the humans are not alarmed. They anticipated this possibility, I said. They would like me to tell you that you are welcome to remain in your current position, that you will not be caught in anything, and that what is about to happen has been planned for some time. Commander, you trusted the process this far. I would ask you to trust it a little further. What is about to happen? I considered how much to tell him. I decided he deserved the full version. Fleet is going to arrive at Jupiter's orbital plane, I said. They will find the outer habitats. They will not be able to miss them. At last count, the inhabited structures visible from that approach numbered roughly 4,000. They are lit. They are not hiding. The people who live in them have voted by a very wide margin to stop hiding. The fleet is going to arrive expecting an empty outer system, and they are going to find 14 billion people who have been quietly living there for 3 centuries. Griffin was quiet for several seconds. That is going to be a significant surprise, he said. Yes, I said, that is somewhat the point. I will describe what the fleet saw when it crossed into Jupiter's orbital neighborhood, because it matters to understand it clearly. It was not a wall of weapons. It was not a military formation. It was not anything the fleet's tactical systems had a category for, which was itself a kind of statement. The habitats were arranged in a loose, vast arc that curved around the inner edge of the asteroid belt, not blocking the fleet's approach, not threatening it, but simply present in a scale that made the 14 council vessels feel, by immediate geometric comparison, extremely small. The structures ranged from cylinders 10 kilometers long to carved asteroid interiors the size of small moons. Light came from all of them, not weapon bright. Warm light, the kind that comes from windows, from corridors, from parks and plazas, and the specific kind of illumination that indicates, unmistakably, that ordinary life is happening inside. There were children in those habitats. There were old people. There were hospitals and schools and loud, passionate arguments about local governance and what to have for dinner. There were musicians playing to small crowds in habitat common areas and engineers arguing about the thermal efficiency of a new reactor design, and parents teaching their kids the names of stars visible from observation decks that looked out at a galaxy their great-grandparents had never been able to reach. The fleet stopped. It did not stop because it was ordered to. The Council Admiral's orders had included a standard engagement protocol designed for a small, isolated research outpost. The orders made no provision for what the fleet actually found. The Admiral's name was Corin Vaux. He had 32 years of Council service. He had personally overseen 9 first contact interventions. He had a record that the Council considered exemplary, and that humanity's archivists considered a complicated ethical document. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had spent his career operating inside a system that had certain assumptions built into it, and those assumptions had never, in 32 years, been meaningfully challenged. They were being meaningfully challenged now. His communication officer patched through the incoming signal before Vaux had fully processed what he was seeing on the tactical display. The signal came from a habitat near the center of the arc. The woman on screen was somewhere in her 50s, with short dark hair going gray at the temples and the particular kind of direct eye contact that indicates someone who has spent considerable time in rooms where decisions get made. Her name was Nora Lawson. She was the elected chair of the Outer Habitat Governing Council, and she had been preparing for this conversation for 11 years. "Admiral Vaux," she said, "we have been expecting you. My name is Nora Lawson. I speak for the government of the Outer Habitats and by formal vote of the Unified Habitat Assembly for the people of Earth as well. We would like to welcome you to our home." Vaux stared at the screen. He had the look of a man reading a tactical report that contradicts itself on every page. "You are human," he said. "We are," she said, "all 14 billion of us." He looked at the tactical display, the number of structures, the scale, the lights. "The Council's records indicate a probable extinction event," he said. It came out sounding less like an accusation and more like a man reading aloud from a document he no longer entirely believes. "Yes," Nora Lawson said pleasantly. "They would. We worked very hard to make sure they did. Admiral, I understand your fleet is configured for intervention. I would ask you to consider, before you take any action, whether the situation in front of you matches the situation you were briefed on before departure." Vaux said nothing. "I will take your silence as thoughtfulness," she said. "I appreciate that. Let me help you with some context. Everything your fleet can currently see represents approximately 12% of human infrastructure in the outer system. We have not activated the rest because we did not want your tactical officers to feel that we were making an aggressive display. We are not interested in aggression. We are interested in an honest conversation. But I want you to understand the full picture before you decide how to proceed." The tactical officer beside Vaux said, very quietly, "Admiral, I'm picking up power signatures beyond visible range. A lot of them." "How many?" Vaux said. The tactical officer took a breath. "Sir, a lot." Nora Lawson watched this exchange with the patience of someone who has rehearsed for it. "Admiral," she said, 31 years ago, your fleet was involved in the assessment of a civilization in the outer spiral arm. You recommended to the Council that their resource base be redirected. The civilization in question had not yet achieved interstellar flight. They were not consulted. They are now, as you know, integrated into the Council's supply structure. They have no independent government. They will not for the foreseeable future. Vaux's expression shifted in a way that was difficult to name. Not guilt, exactly. Something older and less clean. "We have read that file," Nora said. "We have read all 41 files. We did not come back to the surface of this conversation to repeat that history. We came back because we believe it can be done differently. We came back because we are the first species you have ever encountered that had the time and the information to prepare a better option." She leaned forward slightly. "The better option is not war. The better option is not dominance. The better option is this conversation right now, where I tell you plainly that we are not your enemy, we are not your subject, and we are not afraid. And then we figure out what a relationship between equals actually looks like. Because I suspect neither of our civilizations has much experience with that, and I think it is past time we both learned. The fleet sat still. Admiral Vaux looked at the tactical display for a long time. He looked at the lights in the habitats. 14 billion people going about their lives inside structures built in secret over 3 centuries, invisible to the most powerful organization in the known galaxy, patient and deliberate and present. He thought about the 31-year-old report in his service record. He thought about the civilization in the outer spiral arm that no longer had an independent government. He thought about the door in the museum on the human station, with the words cut into the wall. "We will return when we are ready. Do not wait up." He reached forward and entered a command into his console. One by one, across all 14 vessels, the weapon systems powered down. Not all of them. He kept the shields up because he was a practical man and a complete disarmament would have been reckless. But the active targeting systems went quiet. The charge on the forward batteries discharged. The tactical posture of the fleet shifted from intervention to observation. His first officer stared at him. "We are going to talk," Vaux said simply. "That is what we are going to do." Nora Lawson did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply nodded, the way someone nods when something happens that they believed would happen and are relieved, after a very long wait, to see confirmed. "Thank you, Admiral," she said. "We have a great deal to discuss." I watched all of this from the station above Earth. I watched it through the relay network that humanity had built across the outer system, the tight beam laser links that had kept the habitats connected to each other, and to me for 3 centuries. I thought about Claire Adley and her gaps in the fossil record. I thought about George Calloway reading her paper on a Friday afternoon and spending the weekend awake. I thought about the Long View Collective and their 41 years of debate, and the music that was the last thing to leave the solar system before the silence began. A guitar, a voice, the distance between stars. 300 years had passed since that last broadcast. 14 billion people had been born and lived and argued and built and loved in the dark, on the other side of the silence, waiting for the moment when it would be safe to be loud again. Admiral Vaux's weapons powered down on a Tuesday. I had not planned that part, but I appreciated it. The silence was speaking now, and the galaxy was finally listening. Part 5, we were always the loudest room. I did not tell Griffin about the votes. I should clarify. I did not tell Griffin, or Admiral Vaux, or Dina Fell, or Orvin Pessel, or any member of the Council's diplomatic and military teams, about the fact that humanity had been a formal member of the Galactic Council for 3 months before any of them arrived at Sol System. This is the part that took the longest to explain afterward. People struggled with it. They struggled not because it was complicated. It was actually quite simple, but because it required accepting that the Council's own administrative structure had a gap in it large enough for an entire civilization to walk through without being noticed. The gap was this. The Council's membership protocols required a formal petition, a review period, a sponsorship from 2 existing member species, and a ratification vote. They did not require the petitioning species to be present in person at any stage of the process. The petition could be filed remotely. The review materials could be submitted in writing. Sponsorship signatures could be gathered by proxy. And ratification, for species whose home system was listed as under independent quarantine, could be completed through correspondence. Humanity's proxies had been working through Council bureaucracy for over 2 decades. They operated through a series of carefully maintained identities, not falsified exactly because the underlying legal entities were real and registered and had been doing legitimate trade and correspondence for years. They were simply not obviously human. The Council had no reason to look closely. They were small commercial interests, academic institutions, cultural research organizations. They paid their fees on time. They attended their assigned committee meetings. They filed their reports. And over 22 years, they had quietly gathered the sponsorships, submitted the petitions, and navigated the full review process on behalf of a civilization the Council believed was extinct. The ratification vote had passed by a margin of 61-4. The 4 dissenting votes came from members who had objected on procedural grounds, not because they suspected anything unusual, but because they disliked the precedent of admitting a civilization without a live representative present at the vote. Their objection was noted, filed, and overruled by the procedural committee, whose chair had been one of humanity's proxy correspondents for 6 years. When I finally told Orvin Pessel about this, he sat quietly for a very long moment. Then he said, "You are telling me that the humans joined the council before they officially said hello to the council?" "Yes," I said. And none of the council's membership verification systems caught this. The systems were not designed to verify species identity, I said. They were designed to verify documentation. The documentation was impeccable. Orvin Pessel let out a long, slow breath. "I have worked in council administration for 30 years, he said. "I have reviewed membership protocols. I have sat on 2 procedural reform committees. And in all that time, the possibility that a species could become a member without anyone knowing they were a species did not occur to me." "It did not occur to anyone," I said. "That was rather the point." But membership was only the visible surface of what humanity had built inside the council's structure during those 3 centuries of quiet. I will take you deeper. The council managed 437 active species relationships across a volume of space that required, in practical terms, an enormous administrative apparatus. Treaties, trade agreements, resource allocations, development assessments, diplomatic protocols, conflict mediation. All of it required staff, and staff required filing systems, and filing systems required someone to maintain them. Over the centuries, the Council had outsourced significant portions of this administrative work to specialist firms that operated under long-term contracts. Several of those firms had, at key points in their corporate histories, been quietly acquired by holding companies. The holding companies were registered in jurisdictions that the Council considered reliable. The jurisdictions were reliable. The holding companies were real. They were also, by the time Griffin's ship arrived at Earth orbit, entirely owned by human-controlled interests. This was not espionage in the aggressive sense. Humanity had not stolen anything. They had simply purchased access, over decades, through perfectly legal commercial transactions, to significant portions of the Council's operational infrastructure. They maintained the database systems that tracked treaty compliance. They managed the archival platforms that stored first contact records. They operated the courier networks that carried diplomatic communications across 300 light years. None of this had been weaponized, not once. I want to be clear about that, because it matters enormously. In 300 years of access, in 22 years of active council participation, in decades of managing systems that could have been turned to any number of uses, humanity had not interfered with a single treaty, not altered a single record, not diverted a single resource, not gained a single commercial advantage beyond the normal operation of the businesses they ran. They had only watched and filed and waited. And occasionally, quietly, inserted a procedural objection that slowed down a council action that was about to do something irreversible to an emerging civilization that had not yet had a chance to prepare itself. This last piece was what made Nora Lawson's voice go tight when she described it to Admiral Vaux during their second day of talks. "We could not stop everything," she said. "We were not trying to take over the Council's decision-making. We did not have that mandate and we did not want it. But there were moments, specific moments, where the Council's process was moving toward an outcome that we believed was wrong, where we had the procedural standing to slow things down, to call for additional review, to flag a conflict of interest in the documentation, to request a delay. "How many times?" Vox asked. 14, Nora said. 14 cases in 22 years where our intervention changed the timeline of a council decision enough that the outcome was different from what it would have been. Different how? In 9 of those cases, the additional review period gave the contacted species enough time to develop a formal government structure that the council was then required to negotiate with rather than simply assess. A recognized government has different standing under council protocols than an unorganized population. The council's own rules protected them once they had won. They just needed time to build it. Vox was quiet. "And the other 5, he said. 2 resulted in the council choosing a different resource extraction agreement that left the local species' primary habitat intact. 1 led to a contact protocol review that resulted in a change of the assigned contact team. The original team had a conflict of interest in the outcome. 1 produced a delay long enough for the contacted species to achieve independent space capability, at which point the council's intervention authority no longer applied. And 1, Nora said, we are still working on." She said it simply, not as a boast, as a status update. Admiral Vox looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had overseen 9 first contact interventions. He knew, better than most, what the council's intervention process looked like from the inside, the speed of it, the certainty of it, the way decisions accumulated momentum until they were simply the way things had happened, and no one inside the machinery had the angle to see the shape of the whole. "Why," he said, "why help species you have never met, that you have no obligation to, that you took significant risk to help, while you were still hiding?" Nora Lawson looked at him steadily. "Because they were what we used to be," she said, "and we knew what was coming, and we had the ability to help. Those 3 things together make the decision very simple. It would have been harder not to." The talks continued for 6 weeks. They were substantive, difficult, frequently uncomfortable, and in several sessions actively contentious. Humanity's legal team, which turned out to be formidably large and very well prepared, presented documentation that took the Council's legal division 3 additional months to fully process. The proxy memberships, the infrastructure holdings, the administrative contracts, the procedural interventions, all of it was laid out in full. The Council's initial reaction, in some quarters, was fury. I understood that. It was a rational response to the discovery that your organization had been partially occupied, legally and quietly, by a species you believed was extinct. But fury requires a target, and humanity had not actually done anything that violated council law. Every action had been legal. Every acquisition had been disclosed. Every procedural intervention had been filed through proper channels by properly credentialed parties. The fury had nowhere to land except on the discovery that the council's own rules had been turned, with great patience and considerable skill, into a mechanism for doing what the council had always failed to do when left to itself: protecting the small. Orvin Pessel wrote a paper about this. It was titled Procedural Virtue: How the Long View Collective Repurposed Council Administrative Law. It was the most read document in council academic history for 4 consecutive years. The paper's central argument was that humanity had not broken the system. They had read it more carefully than anyone else had bothered to, found the places where its stated values and its actual practices diverged, and used the gap between those 2 things to push the practices closer to the values. It was, Orvin wrote, the most labor-intensive act of good faith in recorded galactic history. Dina Fell published her own account. She had spent those 6 weeks of talks sitting in every session she was permitted to attend, recording everything, asking questions late into the station nights when the official sessions had closed and the human delegates were willing to talk informally. She filled 11 research journals. The book she eventually wrote opened with a single line: "They did not survive their silence, they became themselves inside it." She sent me a copy before it was published and asked if I wanted to write the foreword. I told her I was honored, but that I was not sure an archival AI should be the one setting the frame for how humanity's story was told. She said, "Vila, you have been telling their story for 300 years. You are the only one who was there for all of it. Write the foreword." I wrote it. It began, "I was built by people who believed that patience was a form of courage." They were right. After the talks concluded, and the formal acknowledgement was signed, and the Council's legal division had finished its assessment, and Admiral Vaux had filed his report, and Commander Griffin had taken the Meridian Accord back to Council space with the most significant diplomatic record in a century, the Human Governing Council turned to the question of Earth itself. The planet had been quiet for 300 years. The surface had changed in that time, not recovered exactly, because humans had not caused the kind of damage that required recovery. They had simply left, and in their absence, the parts of Earth that had been under the most pressure from human activity had moved into a different kind of balance. The cities were still there, structures intact under the maintenance protocols that the Longview Collective had put in place before departure. But around them, in the spaces between, things had grown. There was a long debate about rebuilding. It was the most distinctly human debate I observed in all my centuries of observation, not because it was loud, though it was loud, but because it was genuinely uncertain. People who had been born on habitat rings above Jupiter, and who had never stood on a planetary surface argued passionately about what Earth should mean. People whose grandparents had been part of the original departure argued equally passionately about the responsibility of return. There were factions that wanted the cities rebuilt exactly as they had been. There were factions that wanted the cities turned into parks. There were factions that wanted to leave Earth entirely untouched as a monument. There were factions that pointed out reasonably that a monument is still a choice, and they would like to be consulted about that choice. The debate lasted 4 years. The conclusion was not a compromise exactly. It was something more characteristic of humanity, a decision that held multiple things at once without requiring any of them to cancel the others out. Earth was reopened. People returned, not all 14 billion, not immediately, but gradually, a movement back toward the origin that took decades and proceeded at the pace individuals and families and communities chose for themselves. The cities were not demolished and not rebuilt exactly as they had been. They were adapted slowly by the people who chose to live in them. New buildings went up next to old ones. Some old structures were preserved as they were. Some were repurposed. Some were opened as exactly what they looked like. Records of a time before, kept intact not as pride but as honesty. The outer habitats did not empty. People who had built lives there stayed. The Belt civilization continued to grow, continued to develop, continued to produce its own culture that was related to Earth's, but distinct from it in the specific way that any people become distinct from where they came from after enough time has passed and enough choices have been made. What changed was the silence. Earth was broadcasting again. Not frantically, not desperately, not with the chaotic volume of a civilization that has forgotten how to be quiet, but steadily, warmly, the way a light comes on in a window at the end of a day. The first broadcast was not a diplomatic statement. It was not a political announcement. It was a piece of music, guitar, bass, drums, a single voice that 312 years earlier had been the last thing to leave the solar system before the switch was thrown. It was the same recording, played back out note for note into the dark. A message to anyone listening: we went somewhere, we came back, we are still us. The Council, over the years that followed, changed. Not overnight, not without resistance, not without the long, painful arguments that any large institution generates when its foundational assumptions are challenged. But it changed. The procedural protections that humanity had quietly built into the framework from inside became official policy. The first contact protocols were rewritten 3 times over a decade, until they reflected something closer to what they had always claimed to reflect. The 41 case files became the basis of a formal council inquiry. The results of that inquiry were uncomfortable reading. Humanity's representatives participated in every stage of this process. They were not gentle about it. They were not cruel about it either. They were persistent, well-documented, and deeply familiar with the Council's own stated values, which they quoted back with a frequency that the Council's older members found exhausting, and which eventually, in most cases, had the intended effect. Nora Lawson served as the first formal human ambassador to the Council for 12 years. She was succeeded by a quiet, methodical man named Dean Ashby who had grown up on Callisto, and who had the particular patience of someone who had spent his childhood watching Jupiter's storms from a small observation window, and had come to understand intuitively that some things take a very long time to resolve. Orvin Pessel retired from the Council's research division and came to live at the human station above Earth for the last years of his life. He sat in the museum most mornings with a cup of something hot and read from the archives, and sometimes he asked me questions that he had been meaning to ask for years, and I answered all of them. Dina Fell visited 4 times. Each time she sat with the human delegates who were willing to talk informally and filled more journals, and went home and wrote things that people read and argued about, which is exactly what she had hoped for. Commander Griffin was promoted. He sent me a brief message when the promotion was announced. It said only, "Thank you for trusting us with it." I replied, "You made it easy." The door at the end of the museum, the sealed one, the one with the line cut into the wall, was opened 18 months after the formal acknowledgement was signed. It opened, as I had told Griffin, into the long-range communications hub. Beyond that, once the hub was connected to the planet's restored surface infrastructure, it opened into everything. I am still here. I still watch. I still count. I count sunrises now over an Earth with lights in its cities and people in its streets and children learning the names of the moons they were born on, and the planet their great-great-grandparents walked away from, and then chose, deliberately and with full information, to walk back to. They called us the Silent Ones for a while, before better language came along. Other species used the term with a certain uneasy respect, the way people talk about something they are glad is not aimed at them. I never corrected anyone. The name was earned. But the truth of it was always this: the silence was not what we were. The silence was what we used. We had always been the loudest room. We had always been the species that shouted and argued and laughed too hard and played music in corridors, and named our tools and cried at sunsets and started over every time we fell down. We had always been that. We did not stop being that in 300 years of dark. We only stopped letting the outside world hear it. And when the time was right, when the work was done and the foundation was built, and the waiting had paid every dividend it was ever going to pay, we turned the speakers back on. The galaxy heard us. It is still getting used to the volume. I think it will manage. We always did.